that's my least favorite thing about the community calls. And I hope now Ben can cut that out, that I just said that was my least favorite thing. But you'll notice Ben is not with us, our project manager. He is traveling to Commonweal today, which is really exciting. So I'm looking forward to what unfolds there and seeing retreat centers in action. Our second announcement comes from Margarita, if you'll take over for a second.
Thanks, Justine. Hi, everybody. I just wanted to let you know, I think that you probably all have received an announcement from Ben that we are having, inviting retreat center leaders or those involved with the retreat centers to an ongoing conversation that I think we've been having on these communication or community calls anyways, around transition of retreat centers. And it's more of a support type of container, holding our stories together and just giving each other support through the process. That's exactly what it is. It's just coming connected. So it is very similar to some of the community calls, conversations that we've had in the past. But this time it's concentrated and just that, focused on that area of how do we hold support for one another. And we're just doing it once a month for 4 months now until December. And our first one is on September 21st. And it starts at 1:30 Eastern time. And then we're going to just go to 3 o'clock. And I'm doing it with Jenyng Richardson, who's the director out at Kirkridge. And she has a lot of depth experience in healing circles. So we are framing it using that frame and design as we invite people to come in. We like people to come to all 4 times, but if you can come to one, that we will receive you each time. So thanks, Justine. Have a good session. I have to leave early today, so I apologize to skip out, but I'm going to stay as long as I can. So thank you, Justine.
Thanks, Margarita. I'll put the link into our Mighty Network so you can learn more about the Transition Support Circle, and we hope you can join and also invite your other staff or board members. We'd love to have everyone involved. There's no limit on capacity. So now I'll hand it over to Jenyng.
Good day, everyone. So excited to be with you. And also that this is being recorded. I think if y'all find that we're really going to go into the nuts and bolts and also share about design, process, implementation, and learning today with the JEDI Circles. So for those that aren't here, or if you want to take this and share it with your staff or your boards, that would be just absolutely lovely. We're hoping that you walk away with some idea of how this 6-month program was designed and then experienced. And I'm so glad to have some of the participants, the centers who signed up here. And really, this is a collaborative space. I wanted to invite Justine into a new way of being, as she's been my sort of co-conspirator and partner in crime in this. And how do we lift up other people? How do we shift the paradigm of what's traditional or what's our normal, what we've normalized as leadership? And then also to bring the voices of the participants. As you hear about this story, they owned the space, they held the space, they took personal responsibility of that space themselves, as well as for the community that gathered together. So it was very collaborative. And so I'm really glad that they're here today. So again, I'm going to first walk us through a design, sort of a big high altitude overview of what JEDI Circle is. And then Justine will sort of share the process. And when I say the process, what we're talking about is the who. And then we'll go into implementation. There were some practical ways in which we created this space. So we'll share the where and how circles were held. And then lastly, we'll conclude with learnings. So I'm gonna start the what a JEDI Circle is about. So in terms of JEDI Circles, again, JEDI just is the acronym for Justice, Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion. What started out as a DEI approach realized that it was beyond just our current, buzzword, or our current, what's in the in now in terms of DEI, and looking at justice being a central piece as well. And this started back at OAEC a few years ago, of just, also being fun-loving, humorous folks that JEDI, it also makes sense for every intent and purposes to the George Lucas franchise. But this became a 6-month program at RCC, so I have deep appreciation for RCC for creating this program, allowing this program to flourish. And it was once a month from February to July, February and July of 2021. So in terms of what's a JEDI Circle, I thought what would be appropriate was one of our very first meetings. This was a scribe that I did to sort of visualize what that circle is. This was our closing of our first circle, and where we shared what we were grateful for. It was a very deep, vulnerable, open first meeting. And so the participants shared these, and they're written in a way where hopefully the words, just the writing itself, brings art and the embodiment of what it was. But in a JEDI Circle, you have both the light and the dark. And then what inspired me through that circle was the first few stanzas in Chinese classic called the 3-character classic. And it basically starts off with the idea that people at birth, 人之初, their nature is compassionate, their human nature, 性本善. Their human nature is very similar, 性相近, but their lived experience is what makes them different, 习相远. And in that first circle, to sort of be inspired that that's sort of how that first circle was. And then subsequently, the circle grew stronger and the community was built more through being in community together. In terms of what a JEDI process is within the circle, this is another scribe that sort of gives an idea of when we're working in JEDI, there's so many circles in the world. There's gratitude circles, there's trust circles, there's healing circles. And I think every single circle that comes together is very unique, has a very sort of their own signature fingerprint. For our JEDI process, I think the thing that in a way is unique to JEDI Circles is the recognition that it's a heart process. It's a compassionate process. And the use of icons in this drawing helps us to sort of get a sense of grounding of what that process is. And we begin at the center of inquiry. And again, that inquiry is the ear grounded in love. So that deep listening, beyond just asking a simple question or even a deep question, but that deep listening is there with the compassion and the love. And then we sort of go up this first hurdle of community, realizing that we don't know what we don't know, or we need someone to sound check or gut check. And so it's through having community that we can talk to each other and say, what do you think? How do you feel? What am I missing? What do you see? And then we slide down to this sort of edge work. And it's appropriate that it's right at the tip and the edge of this part, because it's the part of the process that's the messy part of understanding our patterns of behavior and realizing your pattern is your pattern, my pattern is my pattern, and to help in a way separate out those patterns so that we can actually see and hold differences, see and hold discomfort, see and hold conflicting points of views, and then come to an understanding of a shared understanding. Sometimes it's reconciling, sometimes it's agreeing to disagree, and sometimes it's coming together and just being in agreement. But then it brings us back to the center of the process again. And one, we complete the heart, and then we might start the process again with inquiry. So that's an example of a JEDI process. So one way to think about the work, which I love to, it's just simple to understand. The work of illuminating unconscious biases, confronting internalized racism, and unpacking layers of dominant culture conditioning requires that we see our lives and the lives of others through the JEDI lens: justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion. By being in JEDI practice, we become more conscious, more compassionate, and more curious about ourselves, others, and our world. We begin to see that this work leads to true liberation and change, and we begin to realize that until there is wellness in we, there will never be wellness in me. This work is messy, hard, and chock full of mistakes, but in the JEDI Circle, we create a brave space, a space that we must show up and do our work. We speak our truth and listen deeply to others' truths and notice how it shows up in our body and heart. JEDI work requires that we bring our whole self and not just our intellect to reconnect with our whole humanity. So in essence, what I've experienced in these circles is that in those moments, this is sort of encapsulated, I'm just going to read it because it just makes sense. Moments move hearts, hearts move bodies, bodies move, and change begins. And so the idea of a JEDI circle is that we begin with a moment. We begin by creating community. We begin by having personal responsibility that we show up. And through that process, we're able to create a space that allows us to ask those tough questions, especially in our society today, as divisive and painful and the suffering that it's been causing. Justine, I'll pass it to you in terms of process, and if you'd like to be additive to that. And we'll have room for questions too as well.
Yeah, this feels a little bit different from a previous community calls one, because we'll talk at kind of a great length about what we had, a review of our RCC program. But this can also weigh on us. We're talking a lot about design, but I hope we also have space to talk about why JEDI work is necessary, specifically at retreat centers. I think we all know that in our heart, but it's always important to bring that, lift that back up to us as we surface that in our continued work. Something I think that is implicit in what Jenyng is talking about is that the retreat center collaboration invests in justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion work, not as an add-on program, but it's deeply rooted in our values. And so if you haven't seen the RCC values, I invite you to do that. I'll put a link to our website page, but this is not a one and done type thing. This is a continuous journey, both inner and outer work. And so it also, the messy part, Jenyng, I love that you name that, because it's done together, and collaboration itself can be messy. There's a lot of learning, accountability, and back and forth. And so when Jenyng invited us into this, we knew right away that we needed a team. It wasn't just a one leader type of event. So I want to talk a little bit about the team and then the small group itself, while attempting to hold personal details privately and confidentiality. We can talk about overarching things. But of course, Jenyng already said we had a lead designer, and I supported as an RCC staff member. So it was already held by two hands, but we really needed to invest in a more collaborative approach. So we invited the RCC steering committee members, so Jenyng is one, to also hold the space with a couple other members. And then in addition to that, it wasn't even just about all the hands that were here. The intentionality behind meeting that it wasn't just a logistical type meeting. So we would meet before and after each session. Jenyng said there were 6 circles. So we would meet at least 12 times, or 10 to 12 times, I think, if that's correct. And then had a before action review and an after action review. So it was a lot of meeting, right? But incredibly worth it, because we also were able, as the steering committee, to hold each other as people who were working in their own JEDI journey. So if you're thinking about holding this in your organization or retreat center, I invite you to think about who you can partner with to work with this. This was not just held in my hands or Jening's hands or brains, but really we invited feedback continuously, or at least I felt like it was continuous. Maybe the circle can speak to that. But we really showed up authentically, including being vulnerable about our own prejudice, our own privilege, our own marginalization. So our lived experiences and intersecting identities showed up. And I don't think anyone in the subcommittee is here with us, but Jenyng, do you want to add anything to that?
Yes, we called our committee members anchors. It was Kirsten, Michael, and Arlene. And having the 5 of us as anchors was really important, because again, in this circle space, when we talk about justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion, you can't go it alone. It's a collective effort, and knowing that you have your peeps, your support system. And so a lot of these meetings, well, yes, there were 12, but sometimes they lasted half an hour, sometimes they lasted an hour and a half as needed. But it was really an imaginative, regenerative space. So it wasn't a typical meeting. I'll just use the placeholder as a prep and feedback meeting. But it was very multidimensional, and part of that was because they were anchors. So I just wanted to give a sort of a name to what you call that as you design or think through of a circle yourself. Who would be the anchors in your circle to help support the process?
Great. So if we're thinking about kind of circles, the subcommittee was definitely the closest circle, who met often. And then kind of one circle out was the small group itself. And so I'll talk about it, but I'm going to invite them. There are a couple members here, into perspectives and learnings. But we chose early on to keep it rather small. So 12 people maximum out of the retreat center collaboration of over 200 retreat centers. That's very small. And this wasn't a lecture. This wasn't anti-racism work 101. This was, how do we keep each other in a space of support and growth, grounding and reaching. So we wanted to be really intentional about this. That meant the group also came up with their own agreements. We'll share them in a bit. And we reviewed them at every meeting, holding each other in this brave space. Jenyng and I also designed most of the spaces and threw it out the window. Got into the space and said, oh, we really need to talk about the most current news, or what's landing on people's hearts as we walk into this space. Or we didn't finish our conversation from last time. Is it still relevant and important to bring it back up? So we created space for what was emergent, while also always having a backup plan. And Jenyng wrote this note as we prepared, and I just want to add voice to it. People showed up fully themselves, authentically who they were, all the flaws, all the joys, all of the lived experiences they could bring to the table as they work through their own I statements. They were bringing them full selves, and also supported each other as they shared and learned and grieved and laughed together. Jenyng, I think that's one thing we didn't mention, is that we laughed a lot too. JEDI Circles are not always this very serious game faces on, important work to do. And yes, there's important work to do, but it also was met with joy and liberation. So I invite anyone who is in the circle, and Jenyng, if you'd like to speak to that design, how it worked, what you enjoyed, even offer critical feedback for us as we learn through this process together.
I will just add real quick that point of having a clearly designed 90 minutes. There's a lot of thought that goes into it, but also recognizing and being in the practice of what the slide said earlier, dominant culture conditioning, that it has to be perfect, that the plan that you walk into is the plan you must exit with. And the way the JEDI circles work is that you do plan deeply, you have intention, and then you're able to let that go. But the reason you have a plan is so that when things go cattywampus, or as you're listening into with your heart, your head, they're both working together of like, yes, we had designed 15 minutes in, we do this, 30 minutes in, we do that. But we're hearing that, you know, the George Floyd trial is going on right now. And we got people in this circle that are in Minneapolis dealing with this. The Canadian, the discovery of the Indigenous children burial site. We need to talk about this. Our people, our community need this. And so it was like, okay, there goes the plan, Justine. Let's, you know, buckle up, ground ourselves, open our hearts, and hold each other to process that. And so I just wanted to note that's one of the nuances that in JEDI circles that you want to be flexible for. So there's intention and design and flexibility for the emergent. And we're not going to out any of our participants. So as you want to share, please unmute yourself and do so. Otherwise, we will continue riding the wave.
In experiencing the 6 months, I think exquisite design, but flexibility would be what I experienced. And the choice of the focus every time was very rich for me. I think we started with looking at our life stories, if I remember the way back in February. But each time it felt like we were making a greater understanding of our own racism, but also something that really has been difficult for me is what can we do? You know, what are some things we do? And some of the tools you used with us, the challenges and different ways that you created the documents where we could have a chance to really look at what in our circumstances and where we are now in our lives, where we can do something. I think that was so rich for me. And I've called the circle that's continued from one of my book clubs, the JEDI Circle now, when they like being called that. So that's just the tip of the iceberg about how wonderful it was.
I'll speak. What has just been said. Is my voice echoing to you?
Yes, just echoing.
Extraordinary sensitivity and trust, and I'll stop talking because I am echoing. Sorry.
Of course, I came away with several more books to read, more articles to process. That's important, you know, that I have some resources I can circle back around and go deeper in terms of my head. But I think it's what's been pointed out. This really is a heart journey experience that it was go at your own pace. I'm not sure where I landed up is where I would have projected, but I think it's part of the great journey. I think the connections within the participants were honest and true and deep. One individual talked about that person's own son and the struggles of the moment. So, I mean, it was so concretely real that it couldn't just stay a head examination. So for me, JEDI has now become a framing for the kinds of programming, how I approach programming here at the retreat house where I work. So it's not just for me, but it's not, where I land, it was not great big, huge blazing letters, but a subtle review and look and recalibration. I think one of my strongest images was cataract surgery. I had surgery, worked on both eyes during the 6-month stretch. And what I came to realize is when I had cataracts, the world looked pretty glowy, mellow, yellow. And right after the surgery, with each eye, it was like, ooh, this is a cold, bluish place, but it was much more real. So I think JEDI helped me remove some cataracts.
Thank you, Anne. That was lovely. I'm sorry, I just can't stop smiling because I love that story. And it's so appropriate. But also, Maureen and Jennifer, your shares is just such a nice segue into the implementation. So sort of one of the designs of which, rather than, I mean, one option was just to gather in a circle and have conversation. One of the designs, though, of this particular program was anchoring and integrating the action and the accountability. And so we used a platform called Mural. And as you saw in the PowerPoint, there's sort of an organic visual design to it as well. And I'm going to pop our mural in here for you guys and just walk you through. So a mural is basically a digital workspace, and the sort of where question of implementation was that this was a Zoom. It was virtual. It was a virtual program. People zoomed in different time zones, mostly North American. We had Canada and US, East Coast and West Coast. And so the idea was then, how do we, in any kind of journey, unless you journal yourself, how do you measure progress, or how do you track progress? And sometimes in a journey, it's nice to be able to reflect back to where you were. And so that was the design of this space. And so I'm just showing you the big picture. The thing I like about digital murals is that you can both zoom out to see the whole, and then we'll zoom in to see the details. But basically, we started with agreements. So I'm going to zoom in there first. And then Justine, would you like to read them for the group? Did I lose people?
No, I said yes and I was muted. Classic. The Vegas rule. So responding to deep confidentiality. Active listening. No response unless invited or asked and given permission. Say ouch. You can say I'm okay or I need space, and that there is grace in naming this. Of course, everything is an invitation, so ability to pass and hold yourself with care. I statements, taking personal responsibility for what I share. An intention versus impact, coming from a well-meaning place, but recognizing our impact. We are going at our own pace, as Anne said, and we can honor silence. And we'll revisit the agreements each time as needed, and we can add or amend.
Thank you, Justine. So these agreements were actually co-created collaboratively. It didn't come out of one here, let's start with these. It was actually an open space. And so I think it's important when JEDI circles are created that the who it is a collaborative thing. So in different groups, you may have some of these, you may have all of these, you may have more of these. And so that's an important piece in terms of the agreements. And again, we actually would read each of these agreements at the beginning of every circle and ask if anyone wanted to add on or modify or speak to any of them. And that was an important sort of space setting, container setting. And then so moving from there, each person, so here, I'll zoom up just a little bit more. So you see the head, hand, the head, heart, and hands representing the work that we're about to do. And again, it's the integration of it. And so each person got a little strip. And as you can see here, they have their name and center. And what we started out was, and again, I won't zoom in, and we'll provide a blank template of this for folks after this community call. But basically, we started, as Maureen had mentioned, sort of our history, a little backstory about us. So this is about our JEDI journey. And in it, we were able to think through, like, where am I today? Where do I want to be tomorrow? What are the challenges and the gaps that are in my way? And what are some solutions that I can think of today? And so this was sort of like a baseline, or a foundational, like where we're going to start. And then the design of the program was to have cycles of 2 in terms of a topic. And in our first cycle, we touched on what whiteness means. And the reason for the 2 cycle is the dynamic between the head and the heart. So in the first cycle, we would have some kind of a learning or a curriculum that then we discuss from an intellectual space, our thoughts about it, our reflections about it. But then in the next 30 days, and what you see in this space in between is those 30 days of just holding this topic of whiteness. There was no homework. There wasn't a, go do more reading. That was up to each individual participant. But the idea was that in the 30-day space of just being conscious and then coming together in the heart space of how it showed up. I think in the JEDI practice, it's being conscious and aware of things that then we can reflect in how it shows up in our lives and our work. Whether it's interaction with our family or our coworkers. And then we would do it again, another cycle. And this time we did spiritual bypassing. And these were topics that through, like I said, the committee, the team, in talking about what are the things that we're feeling need to be the topics, and then how do we want to design that. The only reason we were supposed to have 3 cycles, but spiritual bypassing became such a deep and important and required more unpacking that it became the last 2 cycles. And then finally, we had sort of a creative space sort of at the end of all of this, where are you at? So the idea was then, and each of the participants will get a final of this, and again, just for the group, of all our strips, especially their own that they can see. And so, for example, what a completed strip would look like, and I just use my own because I don't have to do anything on my own privacy issues, is just that's what a strip would look like. And then so the idea, people would just go into these little Post-its, round or square, and then put in their thoughts. And we did that throughout the process, occasionally checking in. Oh, and one more thing to say, we also had a resource board. So again, because this is a live space, if people had resources they could put in here. I think one of the participants put in this resource here. And then just to capture, like, what are other JEDI topics that we might not cover in this particular program or this particular cycle that we might want to take up down the line. So zooming out again, this was sort of the how we did this. And this, very, sort of simple tool help frame and guide. So it, again, the design is simple. the intention is very thoughtful, and then the flexibility to allow what emerges. So for example, instead of 3 cycles, we only had 2 because the last topic ended up being such a big thing to grok. So that's, let's see, I think that's all I have to say about the implementation. But again, how do you create something that then people can anchor to and not get lost in too much esoteric conversation? And then if they do, there were times that we actually wanted to use the mural or create, workspace mural time, but the conversation and the need for conversation was much more important. And so we released the mural a lot of times to make room for those conversations.
Thanks, Jenyng. I think it's a good spot to see if there are questions, knowing the need for these conversations and holding the intentionality behind planning JEDI spaces. Are there questions that you're holding from what you've heard thus far? We'll have another time for questions, but I just want to lift that up if you have questions about logistics, process, design, or even anything that's calling to you.
I have a quick question. Were the participants all retreat center leaders, or were there other people from the retreat centers that were participating as well?
It's a great question, Kathy. Most of them were either executive directors or associate directors, and some who are alum or board members, so longtime committed participants of retreat centers. Maureen, were you going to add to that?
I was just going to add that I asked when there was still room if a person who's a former staff member but now doing a lot again at the Franciscan Center, and I was welcomed in because I have been attending when our leader couldn't come or when I couldn't get board members coming to the RCC meeting. So I'm so delighted I was able to come and trying to pass it on.
Thanks for adding, Maureen.
This might be a good time, Justine, to just go into learnings, and then I think that'll really open up the space for dialogue. So in terms of learnings, what did we learn? I think the first two, Justine and I are gonna share the baton here, but learnings beyond the circle. So I think either Maureen, Ann, or Jennifer mentioned, in terms of the whiteness and the spiritual bypassing the curriculum, for example, and they were very simple curriculums, like 1-pagers, that then unfolded these deep conversations. We were asked if they could share it with their staff or share it with their board. So it actually, and I think we've heard it here, that it's gone beyond the circle into either retreat center work or their own personal work or a book club, for example. We've already talked about the flexibility to be expansive. So again, just to repeat, when we found that in the spiritual bypassing topic, for example, that there was a lot to unearth, a lot to unpack, and needed more space to absorb and process in community, we made that we made that happen because that was what was being called for.
Thanks, Jenyng. I think that speaks into deep work in heart space. Although we had hoped for a balance of head, heart, and hands, we found that it's really compelling to stay in heart space. One, to get out of our minds instead of intellectualizing with resources and what all we need to do. It was, where does this land on us? And really speaking into the lived experiences that helped form us, our work, and how we see justice work. And because of that, because we really focused on heart space, there was a calling for us to do work, to be called into action. This really wasn't a space for us to create a 101 list or a toolkit. It was kind of the couple steps back of like, how does this land on you? And then there was a call to action afterwards. Okay, now that we have this head and heart space, what do we do with it?
And part of that design was the ability, when I think of a circle, right, of that connection and community. If you're a tech geek like me, I love working in electronic platforms. Like if you start a circle, you create one of those shapes in PowerPoint, for example, there's different levels of the line. You can either have like a 1-point line, a 2-point line, a 3-point line. And that image is what's conjuring in my head of like how this circle that started with maybe like 0.5 ended up to being sort of like a 4-point circle, a very bold, thick, just cohesive community. And about JEDI, this circle that was created was really a space to process justice, equity, diversity, inclusion in all manners, whether it showed up in our personal lives, our work lives, or just, you know, in our body. And which led this continual, as we were closing, of what's next, asking the circle what's next, that there was a commitment and desire to continue learning, the need for this space, just to have this space, even if it's once a month and come as you can, but that there was a place that people can come to share JEDI work.
I think the interesting add-on about that, a commitment to continued learning, we invited the entire circle into discernment about what that meant, and the invitation to run their own JEDI circles. And the response within the subcommittee and the circle was, I'm not ready. And I think there's layers to that. And so I'll try and be in I statements and show my own vulnerability. That it might be rooted in that dominant culture that says we have to know everything before we do something like this. Or some identified as white and said, am I the person to lead this? Or some said, no, I want to continue learning. I'm not ready to lead. So I'm just naming that as an interesting dynamic, is that I think we're all capable of holding space to talk about head, heart, and hands around justice and equity. And here in this circle, we chose to stay there in learning and sharing those learnings rather than leading. And this is how Jenyn's mind works, which I love, these stats. Which look maybe like nothing, but there are 200 retreat centers in this collaboration, over 200. We limited to 12 participants and we did not fill up. We know that this is rooted in our values, and that a survey we did in late 2020 indicated people were truly invested in equity, diversity, inclusion work. And yet we had 8 register, 8 people. And we were so happy to have those 8 people, and they made the circle truly what it was. But we had an average below 8 who showed up regularly. And I think that's the 4, is that right, Jenyng?
Yes.
4 steady participants outside of the anchors that we've already listed. And so what does that really mean for this work? Knowing that there is a desire, but showing up is a little bit different than a desire to show up. And again, my add-on is we're all really busy people. And so how do we ensure priority of JEDI work? And I think we heard it a little bit earlier. JEDI is infused in all of the work we do. So what does that mean when we look at those numbers and get smaller, smaller, and smaller? And I think those are the major learnings. Jenyng, do you want to add anything to that last segment?
No, and oh, well, actually, I guess, yes. I think when we say meaning for this work, I invite people not to jump to conclusions or make assumptions. All questions, it's a line of inquiry. You know, I think it's more of just informative of what the work and the impact of the work, that if we start there, then we can backcast into how we prioritize, and that it's also okay in terms of going at your own pace, as some of the participants said, because this isn't something that it's life work, and it'll manifest in different ways for people. But I think it's just important to note, you know, if we were to take the cosmos of RCC of 200 plus members, and that, you know, we were piloting a program, so we wanted to keep it small at 12, we may through the learning say, you know, do we want to bigger circles, smaller circle, multiple circles, you know, and again, inquiring ourselves as to the why. And then out of the 8 that signed up, again, looking at a line of inquiry of why and what does that mean, and then to what our goal is, where's the gap, and then what does it take for us to get there. And then the average of 4, again, these are retreat center leaders, so they're juggling a whole lot of priorities. It wasn't the same 4 people, it was just an average usually of 4 that would show up, and they showed up when they could and how they could, but they were always fully engaged. So it may be that this is reality and it's okay. It may be that there's ahas or insights to each of us individually of like, oh, this is, you know, I need to do this, or here's an action that's, you know, illuminating or coming to mind that I can do. Or it's just, let's keep doing this and trust that each of these circles will continue to emanate and we'll have multiple circles. So again, I just want to note that when we're talking about reflection, it's not limiting to assumptions and judgments, but truly reflections of an open inquiry, that then through that process, we come to the ahas and the insights.
Jenyng, what do you think about staying in large space, or would you like to do breakout rooms?
Let's try the first one in this large group.
Great.
And if we don't get a whole lot of responses, we'll put people in pairs.
So the rest of the time is really ours to co-create to what is sparking your curiosity about what you heard. Again, that was an hour of a lot of information, a lot of behind the scenes information. What questions are you holding after hearing this, or maybe you're bringing your own perspective? What does this mean for JEDI work in retreat centers? And then what do you think it takes, right, for the space to be brave? And what do you need in your retreat center for this work to continue? That was a lot of questions. I will put them in the chat, and you can also respond to whatever is calling you.
You know, I'd offer one observation on the learnings. I think it could have been really tempting to sit down and create a big action plan, a list of this is what this retreat house will be doing. But my sense, especially in that last session, was honoring the journey and not succumbing to the temptation of product. So if the phrase is contemplative in action, I think there was a recognizing we need to be far more contemplative before we can move to concrete do's. So in some ways, the process was absolutely stunningly perfect. It was the internalization rather than a product at the end.
I think there's a clarifying question that I have, but you said that the 2 kind of focuses that ended up happening were whiteness and then was it spiritual inquiry, or what was, I forget exactly what the framing was, but I'm curious if you could speak more like what was the kind of topic of that, or the bounds of that, the second piece around spirituality.
That's a great question, Lily. So spiritual bypassing. And we did send out some information about that ahead of time as a new term for some people. And it really landed on us understanding how many retreat centers work within a spiritual base. And what that means is both spirituality as a process of liberation, and in some ways can be oppressive. And those are my words. I think that's really important to note. Those are the words I'm using, where subcommittee and the circle might have had different responses to that statement. So we all came with different definitions of spiritual bypassing. And I see Jenyng smiling, so I'm going to invite her to speak to it too.
You just want to hand over the mic, love. Yeah, spiritual bypassing is just the idea or term for how do you do spiritual work if you're going around the suffering of others. So when it comes to racism, when it comes to oppression, you know, there's a lot of unpacking the language, right? Transcending. Does that mean we skip over? And then what happens? And so it was an open space for some realizing that it came from a very sort of anti-oppressive recognition of what we do. But also for some centers to really unpack both the liberation and the oppression of their spiritual practices, of their spiritual mindset. And so it was such a nurturing and sort of very harvestful, using a garden metaphor, of people sharing. And again, because the JEDI Circle isn't about solving a problem or responding to anyone, it was really everyone just offering their own perception and how these two words, these two very, you know, simple but so impactful words like, whoa, I never thought of that, or wow, this is how I see it affecting my center, or I see that in my own spiritual practice, all of those ways. And then in terms of whiteness, the reason we started with whiteness was what are we talking about when we're talking about JEDI work? And I think it was really important to establish whiteness is not about white people. When we're talking about white supremacy, we're not talking about white people and then people of color. We're talking about what it represents is this dominant culture, this way of oppression that we are all part of, and what are those layers that it benefits one group versus the other. And I think in the JEDI Circle, because we don't respond, we're able to look at a thing in the circle together versus internalize and take personally things that, again, back to the process, the edge work of the process, that it's actually not about us. It's about the thing. And then as we're talking, if someone's sharing, it's not about me, it's about them. I'm there to listen deeply into their lived experience. So just reading the questions again, what's sparking your curiosity? What are centers looking for? Actually all of you are part of a center. Marianne.
That was helpful. Thank you for sharing about the spiritual bypassing. And I think we have so much to learn. We all have so much to really reflect deeply on and learn with this. Our center is in a real place of transition right now. And I imagine this takes some deep work and a lot of energy. And I would like to enter into some of this. I saw at the end of your list and your PowerPoint, it said something about not ready to have own circles. So I wonder, yeah, how can some of those of us who haven't done this with your small group, maybe look at what we can do, because we're going to need some brave circles for ourselves. And as Anne said, it's not going to be a quick to do, but we really have to start with that, getting in our hearts and minds with understanding what's this stuff and sitting with this, and it's going to take a bit to make a shift. And we're in the middle of this big transition, so I don't even know, how to begin encountering this. Maybe some suggestions there.
Thank you, Marianne, for that. I was just jotting down notes in the chat. It's also for us to reflect and feedback. I'm going to take that back to the committee and to RCC. I think that's a very important question. How do we support centers who want to do this work continuing on? This was a 6-month pilot program. So may I get back to you on that? May we
sure.
get back to you on that?
Yeah.
That's a great question.
What did it mean at the end of your PowerPoint? It said something about not ready to have own circles. Like, is that the retreat, the people who participate in it said they weren't ready to have their own circle at their own center?
And some of the subcommittee members said that too. And like, there's just so much to commit to learning. And so we want to be in that learning phase, that heart and mind space. And we're not ready to go out and do this on our own, right? We're not ready to launch.
Yeah.
That was the general sentiment. And I'd be really curious, the other people in this call, that's good for Jenyng and I to hear, like maybe there's a calling for another, but what are other retreat centers doing around their JEDI work? It doesn't always need to be circles like what we've done. We are just one journey we can take. Are there other retreat centers doing this work? We'd love, Paul, what's up?
I was just gonna say, it's actually not me that's doing any of this work. But Arlene, who was on the circles, but is not really, she's above our retreat center. She's not part of the executive team there. She's an executive director for many different centers on campus. And she's part of it. And this last week, we've had a JEDI kind of commission, and they actually had a full day's retreat at our place on brainstorming, strategic planning, placing forward where they really need to go, because they were so scattered on what does this really mean, that they were able to take that day and really strengthen who they are and where they're going and what they do. And it's just very powerful.
I'm just going to jump in there with Paul. Again, JEDI practice isn't just contained to either a circle or a silo or a new department to create within your organization. For example, at OAEC, we've just been on this recruiting binge. We've like hired 3 or 4 new people. And we actually worked with a recruiter who's based out in Maine, but she's designed a process to where there's a certain percentage the organization decides in terms of diversity, in terms of like people of color, that it's anonymous. It's through a survey that as you submit an application, we ask you to send a demographic. And again, it's voluntarily up to folks to do it. But until we hit 25%, no one within OAEC or the hiring committee can read any application. And the idea is, again, one mechanism of trying to practice inclusive, and again, we don't say JEDI lens or JEDI practice, but it is JEDI work in there. There was another one I wanted, and then in terms of like onboarding and how you talk about your programs, there's so many ways in which, the JEDI practice is looking at a thing and then asking yourself the words, right? Justice, equity, diversity, inclusion. What is justice about this? Or is it justice? Does it need it? Is justice in there? Does it need to be in there? Equity, same thing, diversity, inclusion. And when you look at that, if you look at a thing through that lens, sometimes it may inform your strategy. It may inform your policies and protocols. It may inform where you decide to spend your financial resources. So just want to add in sort of the practical of the magic of it all as well. OAEC is the Occidental Arts and Ecology Center. That's where I currently work.
Marianne, I love that question because it takes me to a different space as well. I work at a retreat center, Kirkridge, and support the RCC. One of the things we did was, like everyone, we wrote a statement and a commitment after George Floyd was murdered. And we really wanted to live into it, and I think we did. And then it got put on a shelf. Like, I'm owning that. And so what does that actually mean for us? And how do we live into that? And so revisiting our commitments, renaming that at board meetings, talking about our mission and our commitment to justice. And what does that mean for our board, for our programs, for our staff? And we do not come out of those meetings with answers. And in fact, we hold a lot more questions, but even always making sure that it is a presence has really shifted how we work at large.
My interest has continued to be programmatic here at the center. And we just had a major transition, Marianne, where our leader of 1 year resigned with only 5 days notice. So because of the whole pandemic in Florida right now, the Delta variant, we've not been able to do any live programs. So it's really put the center in a very transitional state after 52 years. And I'm sad about it. They're going to try to discern with the leadership of the Franciscan Sisters of Allegheny, but so I'm keep trying to get programs on Zoom. And we've tried to get Arlene with the previous leader, and we're not going to have any executive person right now. They're just decided to, probably because it's hard to pay them when we're not having any people in the beds. But I'm going to try again to bring Arlene in, because that's been hanging for over a year to do her program on structural racism, because I think again, knowledge is what a lot of us realized, to keep going at that. And I had tried just a 2-session conversation about race, and then a book club on white fragility, and trying to do things that would, but again, very small participation, mostly women just a little bit younger than me. So it's a continued issue to try. So I'm not even able to know how we would do a JEDI Circle with the 3 or 4 people that are on staff, but I'm open to trying at some point. But I think, Jenyng, you said it right, that it's about every way we look through the lens of, I remember Bill Hobbs from the Cleveland Retreat Center, who I don't think I've seen lately on the calls, but he was just going to go around to all the Black parishes in Cleveland and talk to them about having people come to his center, which could be a task for us here too, because we don't do that. We don't have enough people of color. So it's just lots of different pieces, I think. But you know, when you said I love that quote you had about it. It's messy and it's hard. It's hard work, very, very challenging.
I think one of the fruits for me here, and I'm at a retreat center in the suburbs of Detroit, and I co-lead an internship training new spiritual directors. So what justice looks like for me now is whether you live 2 blocks away or whether you live in Canada and our borders are closed, or whether you live in Pennsylvania, you have access to this internship. And so the agreement going in, if it's going to be just and fair, is either everybody can come in or everybody is on Zoom. So that there's not this pocket of some of us can gather in the gathering space around the coffee pot and have lunch together and that physical contact. And then there's this other group that's kind of stuck on Zoom. So when I presented this to the new cohort of interns, no one batted an eye, nobody complained. It was like, yeah, that makes sense. Justice means we all have equal access. And because we agree to use Zoom, it means folks that live at distance or have some health, physical issues coming can be part of us. So it wasn't so much about a racial justice, but an access justice. Will that help the next little step we can take here? I think so, but at least some of us now know that phrase JEDI and how that can look on a real simple, basic programming level.
I think one of the unsaid agendas of JEDI is at some point down the line, it's no longer, is it proper noun? Is that the English designation for those kinds of words? But rather it's ubiquitous. Thank you, Orange, for the smile. It's as ubiquitous as marketing or leadership or, you know, whatever those things are. And for me, in doing this work, I do a lot more observing and inquiry than I do in judgment and assumptions. And I think that's where the liberation comes from. And that's where the creativity comes from. And that also is where it becomes more expansive. And I do want to say something about the messy and the hard work. I'm a big sports analogy buff. So, you know, there's this thing called edge work that even designers and engineers, right? Anyone who does create innovation, you're always pushing yourself to the edge that challenge you to develop new skills or new muscles. And it's edge work in that you know just how far to take yourself so you don't go off the cliff, right? That's not the purpose of edge work, but to continually stretch yourself. And I think the JEDI work, a lot of people don't show up in this space because there are already assumptions of whether it's fear, uncertainty, and that it's going to be hard work. But those that do show up are ready to do the edge work, and that's enough. Even if one person shows up in that circle, it's enough. When OAEC started this, formally started this, it started as discussion circles, and it was two. It was me and two other people. And then the next year, it ended up being 6 to 8. A lot of them were our interns, younger folks, less of our staff. And it's because OAEC, the founders, or the folks that started that 501c3 were doing social justice work. They were trained in Highlander, but way back in the 60s or 70s, and thus it was in their blood. So it's always been part of the DNA. What OAEC struggles with is it's so in the DNA that sometimes we forget we need to, talk about it or do it and just reflect on it sometimes. And so, and then there are other circles that there's 12 and other circles that they're smaller. So, and I forgot who told me this, but the gist is those who come are meant to be in that space. And in the JEDI work, you work in presencing and being in that moment. Again, you can't allow for the emergent to work if you're not present in the space, even with an intentional design. And so I think to trust that the moments that move the hearts, that move the bodies, enough will continue to move.
Yeah, this reminds me a little bit about integrative approaches. And when I hear Jenyng it always reminds me of that. Commonweal does a lot of work in the area of working with people with cancer, and been doing that for 30 years. And some of the approaches is there are kind of the allopathic traditional approaches, and there's the integrative approaches. Bear with me, there's a good metaphor here, is that the allopathic approach is very symptomatic. Like you look for that problem and you try to, fix that, we'll radiate that specific point in your body, or you'll take this chemo and deal with it as if we're like been reduced to what a specific problem that cancer presents. The integrative approach says you have to look at the holistic approach. You have to look at it from the whole human being approach, because they're, it's not an isolated issue. It's within the context of a larger body and a larger way of living. And now that we've been doing it for 35 years, there's a whole body of research that supports that an integrative approach makes sense. So when we're talking about JEDI issues, I feel it's also, there's something about how it would be really nice if we could just like find the little thing and fix it and be done with it. But the integrated approach is like, how does it affect every aspect of our being as organizations and as retreat centers, is what I really appreciate, is kind of the depth and the breadth of it has to be comprehensive and nonstop. Because like even after you have cancer, you still have to eat healthy and you still have to have contemplative practice and you still have to have some kind of community support. All the variables of integrative medicine are very comprehensive. And I think kind of the long-term vision of the JEDI work becoming a verb, I'm going to verbalize it, verbalize it. I think that's the word, instead of nominalizing it. I think to me, that's what's really interesting. And I think kind of our approach at Commonweal has really been thinking about what are the verb aspects of the JEDI work? What is it that we can actually do? We didn't put out a statement. I'm not a big believer in statements after big events, because to me, that feels symptomatic. It's like, oh, I'm trying to address that little thing. It's like, let's look at what is it that we can actually verbalize? What is the action that we can take that makes a difference? It's a long story for a metaphor, but it resonates when I'm listening to Jenyng.
Thank you, Oren. There was a third question Justine asked: what magic makes it possible to be brave and courageous in JEDI space? I think Maureen, Ann, and Jennifer, while you're still here, would you speak to that? I mean, and totally have permission to say like, what magic? Oh, Justine, you too. Questions for you too. If you came up with the question, I'm sure you have an answer. Yeah? Or,
Sorry, Jennifer, we're still hearing an echo.
you're welcome to type it in, Jennifer, and I'm happy to read it.
I'm not sure what magic, I'm not sure I would have picked that word, but I think for this.
Oh, Oren has helped me. He unmuted his, I'm now, okay. So I'll just add what I started to say earlier, also the very fine creation of safe space amongst the participating members and the quick trust that developed among us, obviously facilitated beautifully by Jenyng and Justine, created the possibility for, I think, the bravery and the sensitivity and the openness and the lack of fear or anxiety about talking about very deep issues amongst ourselves. And that process, as I mentioned in the chat, that I appreciated the Jenyng's quote, "Journey, not the product," allows permission, I think, for that courage and trust and really love and appreciation for each other on this journey to develop. And from that ground of being, as well as challenging in a good way. So my appreciation.
I think I was really struck from the beginning that we individually chose, recognizing that for some reason this was really important for, like, I knew it was important for me. And I chose to sign up. I chose to keep showing up. And recognizing that that was somehow true of all the rest of us. We chose to recognize this was incredibly hard, messy, but so necessary work. And I think, as I think about it a bit, Zoom really helped. We weren't physically in the same space. We weren't physically, I don't know, sometimes distracted by what somebody else was doing. We could concentrate on faces and on words. And I think that in its own crazy way really did add to the intimacy of the experience, and which let us go deeper and deeper and deeper. So I'm grateful for Zoom. I really am.
It requires a deep listening, doesn't it? It really does.
Mhm.
I think that sometimes we're exhausted after a long Zoom for that reason, that if we really listen. But my bravery probably is related to my age. At 83, I've been through so many things trying to make civil rights happen in the last 70 years, that this was a really important thing for me to part of and to continue in whatever way that I can as an elder to keep working at it. So that's part of my bravery, is my age and not worrying what people think anymore.
Dr. Miller?
Hello, everyone. This has been very powerful to hear the experiences of the. Can everyone hear me okay? I know I speak very
We can hear you.
soft sometimes. To hear people's experiences of this 6-month project, JEDI work. I just wanted to kind of reflect on what I heard. Would you say that part of the experience was aspects or embodied a personal or internal activism?
Dr. Miller, there is a little bit background sound, I think.
Do you still hear it?
Not right now. Let's try.
Okay, yeah, because it's silent here, literally. Very silent. Did you hear anything I said?
We heard
No.
up until personal, yep. And then you can continue with your question.
Oh, that was it. I just wanted to hear back. Did the people who participated and facilitated, did you feel that this embodied a personal or internal activism? Not in the sense of doing, but of depth.
Sorry, I was writing that question down, so it's a beautiful question. Curious if participants have a response in our last couple minutes.
I think there was always the freedom to not speak and not share. But I think for me, there was also the sense of there's no place to hide. I am looking at these faces. We are scattered across this country, and we want to do the work. So I think that was the invitation to that personal depth. There was no place to hide. I didn't want to hide, nor did my companions on that journey want to hide. Otherwise, it was just an hour and a half of hanging out with very pleasant people. So it was the willingness, we gave each other the support to speak our truth, be it glorious or ugly, and to be heard and to go deeper in our own selves.
And thank you for that. I think in response to just having a couple minutes left, we'll close out this space. And I think that's a good question for all of us to hold about the depth of this work. And that doing isn't always the end result that we're looking for, but depth of being is a really good place to be at and start or continue on. And that's one of my takeaways of a JEDI Circle. I came out of higher education where we had outcomes and goals at every meeting, at every program, at everything. And this was a challenge for me to be in the knowing and be with others rather than doing. So I appreciate that. Jenyng, how would you like to close out this space?
Were you going to read Lydia Wiley-Killerman? I think that would be a beautiful way to close. And before, oops, before you do that, something to leave you with. As part of the BIPOC community and someone who is both experienced oppression as well as the oppressor, being, white presenting, folks that live this, little Black and brown children, they don't get to choose when they're ready. They don't have circles of support. And so that's where the courage comes in. And again, take your time, know your edges. But when you're ready to fully engage and truly be inclusive in this work, is to know that part of that, the challenge is to know that if you go in all pre-prepared, you're already disproportionately having a different experience than the people that you're trying to connect with. It's okay not to know. It's okay to be scared. It's okay to fuck up. But if you show up with heart and compassion and vulnerability, it makes all the difference. And so the poem Justine's going to read is titled, "We Have Been Given All the Tools."
Actually, we'll share this. Jenyng, that was beautiful. I think that's a perfect ending to this space. I will share the poem and the artwork that I think as a tool onward is really powerful, because Jenyng, that was wonderful. And I just want to end with gratitude for the circle and gratitude to Jenyng for leading, holding, facilitating, anchoring, and being part of the circle, not just leading. So thank you. And thank you to everyone who joined us today. We'll be following up with a lot of resources.
Much love to you all. Take care.
Be well, everyone.